Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. This is Jennifer Caddick with the Alliance for the Great Lakes. I am here in Chicago. Joining us today for the webinar, we have a number of panelists. We'll be joined today by Molly Flanagan, who's the Alliance for the Great Lakes Vice President for Policy, also here with me in Chicago. We will have Crystal Davis, who's the Alliance for the Great Lakes Policy Director based in Cleveland. We'll be joined by Tony Moss, who is with Freshwater Future, calling in from Ontario, Canada. We'll have Megan Powell calling from Junction Coalition based in Toledo, Ohio. Nick Acapenti, who is with the Michigan League of Conservation Voters, calling us from Ann Arbor, Michigan. And Pete Booker with the Ohio Environmental Council, who will be calling in from Columbus, Ohio. Before we get started today, I have a few administrative items to just cover very quickly. We're very excited. We have over 320 people registered for today's webinar. As a result, because it's just so many people, all of the participants will be on mute for the duration of the webinar. But we will be sure to leave lots of time for question and answers at the very end. You can submit a question at any time using the chat box, as you can see here on the screen. So you can submit a question throughout the webinar or at the end during the Q&A session, and we will moderate and try and get to as many questions as possible. We'll start off today's webinar by hearing from Crystal Davis with the Alliance for the Great Lakes. And Crystal, I will turn it over to you to get started.
Thank you, Jen. Good afternoon, all. We want to start by talking about the problem that exists. Lake Erie has a persistent problem with harmful algal blooms. These toxic blooms undermine the regional economy and threatens drinking water for millions of people, as we saw 4 years ago in Toledo, and we've seen in Peely Island and other communities. Polluted runoff from agricultural lands is the main driver of Lake Erie's yearly algal outbreak. But reducing this pollution will significantly reduce harmful algal blooms and improve the lake's health. Today, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration issued its annual harmful algal bloom forecast for Lake Erie. And the acronym is NOAA. Once again, we can expect a harmful algal bloom in western Lake Erie. It's become an annual event, and the only question now is how bad will the algae bloom be, and not whether or not there will actually be an outbreak of toxic algae. The forecast indicates that this summer's bloom will be smaller than in 2017, but still larger than the bloom in 2016. Essentially, there's more confirmation that algae is still an issue in Lake Erie. And so we encourage you to recreate and enjoy the benefits of our beautiful lake. But the bloom is a reminder that there is still work to do to lessen the threats that the threats to this important natural resource. And we would be remiss if we did not stop to thank NOAA and Sea Grant and Heidelberg and others for providing this important tool by which we monitor our lake's health. It's also imperative to note that this problem is preventable and the situation is unacceptable. Lake Erie, and every Great Lake for that matter, ought to be clean and safe for all people, and not so polluted that it's a threat to our health and to wildlife and to our regional economy as well. In June 2015, under pressure from people across the Great Lakes region, the governors of Ohio and Michigan joined the Premier of Ontario and committed to reducing the amount of phosphorus pollution running into western Lake Erie by 40% by 2025. People who depend on Lake Erie want to know what actions the jurisdictions are taking to reduce harmful algal blooms. And for a long time, we didn't see a lot of movement, but there have been some recent developments that we'll be talking to you about today. still, we cannot help but to feel like the situation in Lake Erie has become business as usual. 4 years ago in Toledo, a major Great Lakes city, they had to ban drinking the water supply it draws from the lakes for 2.5 days. A few weeks later, residents of Pelee Island, Ontario, faced a similar ban that lasted nearly 2 weeks. People living in these cities remember the trauma of not being able to drink their water. And today, we have with us Megan Powell from Junction Coalition in Toledo, and she's going to share some on-the-ground perspective from an organization that's working in the community.
Hello, everyone.
Passing it over to you.
Powell. I'm the environmental specialist at the Junction Coalition. In Toledo, we're still going about business as usual, continuing our day-to-day. The Junction Coalition is a grassroots organization that is focusing on building a productive community and building a bridge between community and government. The traumatic experience of not having access to clean water is long-lasting. The forecast today is important to Junction for many reasons. One, for example, on this past Earth Day, the Junction Coalition broke ground on our homegrown habitat called What Blooms on Bloom, where we will be growing fresh fruits and vegetables for Junction residents right here in the community. The success of this project depends on a lot of things, and one is having access to clean water. Our plans include a rain catchment system, but we can't depend on the rain to bring in the amounts of water we need to successfully grow crops. Depending on nature would be ideal and cost efficient, but realistically, Junction knows what it needs. A friend of mine is running a nonprofit urban garden here in Toledo. I mentioned the forecast to him, and his first thought was that he wouldn't be able to afford bottled water to water all of his crops if we did have another crisis. He's not only growing food for the community, but he's also growing flowers that he sells to help with the garden's expenses. Another example is this past Sunday, I was in Costco with my mom. We were doing some shopping, and there were plenty of pallets of water from wall to wall. And I heard one gentleman say, grab 10 cases, we're stocking up, because you just never know when there will be another harmful algae bloom. It was kind of shocking to me, and me and my mother talked about it later, but at that moment, all I could think about was how we're in a constant state of fear. I hear people talk about not having access to clean water all the time in Toledo, but what I don't hear a lot of is us discussing what it's going to take to fix the issue. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of the webinar. At Junction, we're committed to working with our partner organizations to elevate policy solutions that mitigate nutrient pollution and lead to harmful algae blooms. Additionally, we have taken the charge to bring the information back to the community so they can join us in this movement. So thank you once again.
All right. I guess it's over to me. I'll just jump right in. It's Tony Moss with Freshwater Future, and as noted at the front end of the webinar, I'm calling in from Kitchener, Ontario, Canada, actually, and we're happy to be a partner on the last year's assessment of progress with the Alliance for the Great Lakes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a couple things. I'm going to quickly give a little bit of background on the domestic action plans that have been developed to address this issue in Lake Erie. And then I'll give you a little bit of an update on where things are at in the province of Ontario right now. So what are domestic action plans? Well, we refer to them often in shorthand, and we probably may do it here. We refer to them as DAPs. They are plans that have been developed by Canada and the United States to lay out the specific actions that will be taken by governments and other partners to reach the agreed upon binational target of 40% reduction of phosphorus reaching Western Lake Erie. So the DAPs, so the domestic action plans, deliver on a specific commitment agreed upon by the two countries, by Canada and the US, under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. And if you want to get into more detail, that's under Annex 4 of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, which is the Nutrients Annex. So there's a specific commitment there underneath that annex that says that Canada and the U.S. will develop domestic action plans to reach targets for phosphorus reduction in Lake Erie. The Canadian Domestic Action Plan was jointly developed by the Government of Canada with our Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, or Environment and Climate Change Canada as the lead, and the Government of Ontario with what is now the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks as the lead. So they jointly developed that Canada-Ontario Domestic Action Plan, or the Canadian Domestic Action Plan. The U.S. Domestic Action Plan brings together individual plans developed by the state in the Lake Erie watershed, along with federal efforts. And I think Molly's going to unpack that a little bit more further on in the webinar. So all of these plans, including earlier drafts, are available and accessible online. If you just search for domestic action plans and Lake Erie, you should be able to come up with this material. So where are we at in terms of Progress Ontario as it relates to policies to address the phosphorus runoff, phosphorus issue, and the resulting algae blooms? Well, the main piece of progress really on policy is the development and release of the domestic action plans. That's been the main piece of new work, I would say, since we worked with the Alliance for the Great Lakes to release the assessment on progress last year. The Canadian Domestic Action Plan includes over 125 commitments, and they do include things like considering further restrictions on winter spreading of nutrients, for example, of manure, and greater compliance with nutrient management strategies as a couple of examples. We heard earlier from Crystal that agricultural runoff is the primary, not the only, but the primary driver of the problems. So while we're quite supportive of the domestic action plans, the true test obviously will be their implementation and the results of the actions that are taken. And we still have some concern around significant dependence on voluntary programs to reduce farm runoff. The concern that may not produce the reductions in phosphorus needed to address the algae problem. So important to that as well is making sure that we have strong monitoring programs in place to track progress along the way. And then the other key point just to raise about progress, or at least change, is the election of a new government in Ontario last month in June. And as part of the campaign, the new government's campaign platform, they committed to protecting and preserving our waterways and to improving enforcement by increasing policing of major polluters. So that suggests that there will be a continued focus on issues like the ones that we're seeing in Lake Erie. But I do think it will be important for us to ensure that our new elected officials in the province are familiar with the problems in Lake Erie and the risks that they pose to the environment, the economy, and communities. And that the province stays committed to working with our federal government here in Canada, but also with U.S. colleagues at the federal and state levels to ensure that we do indeed protect and preserve Lake Erie by better enforcing pollution rules in the province. So that's the update from Ontario, and I think I'm passing it along to Pete.
Thank you. My name is Pete Booker with the Ohio Environmental Council. I serve as Water Resources Director here, and a lot has changed since this occurred last year here in Ohio. The biggest change that took place is likely the Ohio Environmental Protection Agency designating the open waters of western Lake Erie as impaired due to algae. Before this designation this past spring and early summer, previously only the near shorelines had been designated as impaired, and something that the state had developed that they claimed they didn't have in the 2016 report when they chose not to designate the waters impaired is really something they collaborated with some of the departments of higher education at various universities to create a measurable criteria, which is something that can make this impairment designation possible and measurable going forward. And so this is a step in the right direction because it formalizes that the problem is not getting better, but it doesn't come with any instant money or further action. The state has claimed that they do not intend at the moment to create a total maximum daily load for the watershed, which is typically the next step under the Clean Water Act. And at the moment, it looks like judicial action might be the only thing to force them to do so. Additionally, Additionally, as it was mentioned, the domestic action plans were formalized and compiled earlier this year. And as it was previously mentioned, these are formed for the various governments to address nutrient loading to meet our phosphorus reduction goals for the Lake Erie watershed. The Ohio plan relies heavily on voluntary practices, but it also acknowledges that the difficulty in relying on these voluntary measures alone to achieve our 40% reduction goals and likely incentives and regulations combined with voluntary practices will be needed to do so. Just yesterday, Governor John Kasich signed the originally titled Clean Lake 2020 bill that reached his desk. There were several non-related programs that got included in the legislative process, but the original Lake Erie related materials and programs didn't change. And just to quickly go through some of the highlights of this legislation, it touches on some key areas surrounding harmful algal blooms, and that includes funds for Ohio State Stone Laboratory on the research side, funds to go towards Northwestern Ohio soil and water conservation districts. They're really boots on the ground implementing some of these best practices. It provides funds for the Healthy Lake Erie initiative, which deals with dredge materials out of the lake. And then it creates a new soil and water phosphorus program, which will allow the Ohio Department of Agriculture to target resources in the Western Lake Erie Basin to subwatersheds for agricultural best practices. And so they have quite a bit of wiggle room with that, and they haven't decided exactly how those funds will be used as it was just signed yesterday. There is a longer term funding option that is sitting in the legislature that hasn't gotten much movement, and those are entitled Clean Water Improvement Bonds. And if those made it through the process and were signed and then voted on by the Ohio voters, that would allow up to $100 million a year to be spent for 10 years, totaling $1 billion. And the funds were intended to target water infrastructure and algal bloom reduction practices. But again, the governor reinstated yesterday that he is not very supportive of such a bond measure. And then the big news that came out of our state yesterday before the bill signing that I just mentioned was the governor signed an executive order that would direct portions of the Maumee River Basin to be considered as watersheds in distress. And just to quickly run through those 8 sub-watersheds, that includes Platter Creek, Little Flat Rock Creek, Little Auglaize River, Eagle Creek, Auglaize River, Blanchard River, St. Mary's River, and the Ottawa River, which mostly are southern portions of the Maumee River watershed. And these proposed rules in the executive order would require nutrient management plans to be developed for agricultural operations in those watersheds that are 50 acres or larger. And just quickly estimating yesterday, the Ohio Department of Agriculture estimates that that's anywhere from 6,500 to 7,000 farms, and they suggested that was 40% of the acres in the basin. And a lot of producers in that area likely already have these nutrient management plans, as that's been a strong effort by the industry of late to get everyone working under a nutrient management plan. These actions proposed in the executive order still need to be approved by the Ohio Soil and Water Conservation Commission before they would take effect, and the Ohio Department of Agriculture intends to present them to the commission on July 19th here shortly. And then following that approval, the exact rules would still need to be ironed out in our JCAR process, the Joint Committee on Agency Rule Review. And just to tie that back into the Clean Lake 2020 funds, I would assume most of those would be heavily directed towards these 8 sub-watersheds to help enact what the governor pushed for yesterday. And so those are some of the major updates in Ohio surrounding Lake Erie at the moment.
Hi, so this is Nick Acapenti with the Michigan League of Conservation Voters, and I'm going to give you a little update of what's going on in Michigan and around our domestic action plan. So again, just a reminder, a domestic action plan is just a guiding document towards achieving a healthier Lake Erie ecosystem. And Michigan's domestic action plan is focused on 3 key objectives: reducing harmful algal blooms in the Western Basin, eliminating the hypoxic zone in the Central Basin, and reducing cladophora growth in the Eastern Basin. Cladophora is the nuisance algae, which we're familiar with. We've been to the Great Lakes and seen the green kind of slimy stuff wash up along the shore. This is a domestic action plan that was finalized on February 28 of this year, and it's got some positive objectives targeted to summarize a pretty long report, it's a good, excellent kind of start, excellent starting place. The objectives are there, but we don't see a lot of teeth or a lot of way to kind of go after some of these problems. And what we see from that is that we are lacking in kind of a way to bring about some enforcement mechanisms. So we have a lot of work to do policy-wise in Michigan, and have seen some progress on some standards, but just not a whole lot of action at the moment. So just one example of Michigan is the only state in the country with lacking statewide uniform septic standards. Now, all other 49 states have them. We do not. We saw some progress this year with the first hearing in our legislature on uniform septic standards, and it did not make it very far in the legislative process. It's kind of stalled out, but we might see some progress around kind of increased tracking of those systems. So, there are a number of issues in which Michigan needs to move on a policy basis. And the Domestic Action Plan targeted both policy and then objectives for ways to improve the ecosystem in Lake Erie. And the two primary policies were indeed statewide uniform septic codes and then the drain code. So on those two fronts, again, not much progress, but at least we did see hearings in the legislature. As far as the objectives go, and I'm going to be open to more questions and details on the code, but what we see in the Domestic Action Plan is a focus on 3 subwatersheds. So the mouth of the Detroit River, the River Raisin, and the Maumee. So 3 focus areas in the Michigan Domestic Action Plan, consistent with the Annex 4 process, which is a process laid out in the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. Again, the River Raisin watershed, the Detroit River mouth, and Michigan's portion of the Maumee River are really the focus of Michigan's Domestic Action Plan. The last point I'd like to leave our guests with is Michigan is having a lot of water problems right now, from kind of an emerging PFAS crisis, which is happening nationally. We've had a lot of local PFAS contamination issues associated with former military bases, and it's really starting to drive the narrative and the political races in the campaign this year. It's a big issue. Citizens are talking about it. It's active. It's in the media every day. Of course, this is coming off of the lead crisis in Flint, and obviously Michigan is surrounded by the 4 of the 5 Great Lakes, and we're excited because we just see it as a dominant issue in the campaign, and that's not always the case here. So I'll leave it at there, and I know I didn't go into a lot of detail on our Domestic Action Plan, but I'm happy to ask questions as we move towards the engagement section. Thanks.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks to all of our speakers. This is Molly at the Alliance for the Great Lakes, and I'm going to do a little bit of a recap. As you've heard from our presenters, progress has been somewhat mixed in the jurisdictions. We have had, as Pete mentioned, some exciting recent developments in Ohio, and we're going to need to maintain that momentum and capitalize on that momentum in other jurisdictions as well, to make sure that they are all taking the actions necessary to clean up Lake Erie. Unfortunately, the challenges facing Lake Erie are the type of issues that require sustained long-term commitment from the jurisdictions. We need serious action to solve this problem. As Tony mentioned, there's a new administration that was elected in June in Ontario. And for those of you in Ohio and Michigan, you'll have new administrations being elected in November. So there's a real opportunity now to create the change we'd like to see. We appreciate some of the steps that the existing administrations in these jurisdictions have taken, and we want them to keep going and driving toward cleaning up Lake Erie as long as they're in office. And we also need the next administrations to double down and make sure that we do what needs to be done to clean up Lake Erie. And we have some items that they can commit to that will make a difference for Lake Erie. Last fall, we released a report, Rescuing Lake Erie, that outlines our priorities for immediate next actions to protect Lake Erie. And we know that even if the jurisdictions did all of these things, it wouldn't totally solve Lake Erie's problems, but it would take us considerably down the road in the right direction toward the things that need to happen.
Immediately, we want all of the jurisdictions to ban the spreading of nutrients, whether it's from manure or chemical fertilizers, on frozen and saturated ground. We want comprehensive nutrient reduction plans, like the type that are potentially going to occur in some of the watersheds in Ohio under the executive order. And we definitely want improved water quality monitoring in all of the jurisdictions so that we understand where the biggest problems are in the watershed, and also so that we can understand what agricultural practices are working best to reduce nutrient pollution to Lake Erie. Some of the other recommendations that we make in this report is to expand wastewater infrastructure requirements to make sure that we're not only depending on pipes and tunnels to manage stormwater and pollution, but that we're also using green infrastructure or natural infrastructure like wetlands to help filter out pollutants and reduce the amount of stormwater from cities getting into Lake Erie. As Nick mentioned, we need jurisdiction-wide septic codes that make sure that septic systems are inspected regularly and that any problems are corrected. And then finally, we want to expand wetland restoration efforts across all of the jurisdictions, because wetlands serve like kidneys do in the human body, and they help filter out pollution and can help improve water quality in Lake Erie. So while some progress has been made in the past year, much more is needed in each of these jurisdictions. And as folks have mentioned with the domestic action plans, one of the things that we feel is really missing, whether you're looking at the U.S. or Canadian domestic action plans, is the need to identify specific deadlines for implementing enforceable actions to clean up the waters of Lake Erie. And as many of you know, the people around the lake are depending on it. So I want to thank you so much for joining us for this webinar today. And now it's your turn to be heard. We need you to contact your governors in Premier and thank them for taking the steps they have taken, and let them know that their work isn't done. And it won't be done until we no longer need a harmful algal bloom forecast each year. You can learn more by visiting any of our websites, and you're going to receive an email after this webinar that will prompt you to email your governors in Premier. It'll include links to our partners' websites and links to action alerts so that you can communicate directly with the governors in Premier about the actions that need to be taken to protect Lake Erie. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jen so we can get to answering your questions.
Thank you, Molly, and everybody for that informative presentation. Now we have plenty of time for questions. To submit your question, just use the chat box, which is probably generally at the right hand of your screen, and we will try and get to as many questions as possible. I have one first question here, which I think I'll start off with asking Crystal Davis of the Alliance for the Great Lakes to answer it, and then I'm sure Pete Booker with the Ohio Environmental Council will want to weigh in. The question is, could your groups touch on whether they support Governor Kasich's executive order, or do the groups oppose it in favor of something else? Do you want to start with that one, Crystal, and then hand it over to Pete?
Sure. The Alliance for the Great Lakes is supportive of the governor's executive order. We believe it's a step in the right direction, especially coupled with the other actions that have taken place in recent days with the Clean Lake 2020 legislation and the executive order and the impairment designation. We believe that these are all steps in the right direction. No, we don't believe that the executive order alone or these actions alone will get us to the results that we need in terms of cleaning up the lake, but we do think that we're on the right path, and we can appreciate the actions that have occurred.
Pete, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think Crystal summarizes very well. And the thing that we just have stressed so far, the last 24 hours or so, is, these rules are still several weeks or several months off from being completely finalized. So this was a good step, but the process still needs to unfold, and we hope it's a launch pad to keep doing more and keep going forward for Lake Erie.
Thanks, Pete and Crystal. I have another question here that I'm assuming one of us can answer. And so, Pete, maybe you or Megan with Junction Coalition would have some thoughts on this, or maybe Crystal. The question is, have you heard about the Lake Erie Bill of Rights citizen initiative that is planned to be in Toledo on the Toledo City November ballot? So those of you in Ohio, I don't know if you're familiar with that and could speak about that initiative. No? Well, certainly. Go ahead. Go ahead, Pete.
I was saying, I've only heard of it by name. Unfortunately, I don't know all the details of it at the moment.
Megan in Toledo, do you know anything about?
No, I haven't heard anything about it, but I can look into it and we can talk about it at a later date.
Perfect.
That sounds great. Sounds like something we all need to learn a little more about. Thanks, everybody. So the next question, maybe for you, Molly, or some of the other state folks, is a question about monitoring. And this is certainly something that we've talked about quite a bit with our Rescuing Lake Erie report and the need for more monitoring. And so I don't know if we could talk about why monitoring is important to this effort, and you know, any particular thoughts on monitoring. I guess I'll start off with you, Molly, and then there's others who could probably answer the question.
Yeah, so monitoring is really critical in this watershed, and I don't want to leave anybody with the impression that there isn't water quality monitoring going on, because there's some really great work going on, and we know that because that monitoring that Heidelberg and USGS, the U.S. Geological Survey, and others are doing across the Western Lake Erie Basin is the reason that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration was able to do the harmful algal bloom forecast today. You know, that monitoring is critical. So I don't want anyone to think that monitoring isn't happening. But more monitoring is needed, and where it's needed is further up in the watershed. We need to have a better sense in all of the jurisdictions of what the water quality is like in smaller streams that are feeding into larger rivers and eventually into Lake Erie. And the reason for that is that we want to understand and be able to do, you know, what we like to call adaptive management, so that as we're trying things, as we're implementing practices on agricultural lands, as people are changing practices on the land that they own, we can get a better sense for what is working and what's not. How are the actual water bodies responding to the different practices that are being implemented? Something else that some farmers are doing that I applaud them for is they've put in edge of field monitors. So those are monitors that aren't actually in the stream, but that are right at the edge of farm fields that help them know what is coming off of their field. So it gives them a better sense of what's coming off in runoff from their fields. And that information has been hugely helpful to universities and governments in terms of understanding how some conservation practices are functioning or aren't on particular farm fields. And so this type of water quality monitoring, funding for this type of water quality monitoring, both at the edge of field and in the watersheds, is really, really critical to figuring out as we go along what's working and what's not, and being able to make adjustments so that we're doing the most effective things to clean up Lake Erie.
Thanks, Molly. Do any of the other panelists want to weigh in on that question?
Yeah, this is Nick. I can weigh in from Michigan. So just to be really specific and put a fine point on that, two of our primary objective areas are, one, the river raisin and spring soluble reactive phosphorus loading, and the same in the Maumee River. And our key load reduction targets in those areas are all NA, not available, because there is no soluble reactive phosphorus loading estimate for the river raisin or the Maumee River. So research is needed, and indeed this monitoring is just key to not only establishing baselines, but finding out where we're going.
Yeah, Jen, I'll just weigh in from Ontario quickly, and I think I might have raised this point last year when we did a similar webinar, but in Ontario we have somewhat unique entities called the conservation authorities, which folks may know about, and they are really vital to our monitoring programs. Of course, the province does monitoring as well, but in terms of kind of getting at the hot spots and understanding the changes happening when we begin to implement plans and strategies, our conservation authorities are very critical in doing a great job of monitoring out there in the watersheds.
Thanks, Tony. Our next question, which I just lost. As a side note, regarding the question earlier about the ballot initiative in Toledo, I do have a note here that a group named Toledoans for Safe Water is the group collecting signatures on that, and so certainly we'll follow up and get more information on that ballot initiative. Thank you for sharing that information. The next question I have is asking whether or not there is a ban on applying soil conditioners to frozen or saturated ground. We certainly have talked about applying manure to frozen and saturated ground. And the question is, who and how would monitor and assess compliance or enforcement on that? So I don't know, Pete, if you could answer that question for Ohio, or Nick in Michigan.
Yeah, so in Ohio, the Western Lake Erie Basin watershed, almost the entirety of the northwest corner, from the 2015 law, Senate Bill 1, has manure and fertilizer application restrictions in frozen, snow-covered, and highly saturated rain events. The ground's highly saturated from rain events. And so that, and then in the Grand Lake St. Mary's watershed, it is a hard calendar date under their specific watershed and distress rules in the winter months when they cannot apply. And so it's largely a complaint-driven system where, whether it's a citizen or possibly a soil and water conservation district staffer, would likely have to initiate the complaint or the investigation, and then it would work its way through, the Ohio Department of Agriculture and some of our various state agencies. But to get it started, it's really a complaint-driven system.
Yeah, so we don't have in Michigan. We don't have strong frozen ground manure application policies in place. Ultimately, our primary system of kind of proactive engagement is called the Michigan Agricultural Environmental Assessment Program, and it's a voluntary initiative to engage farmers on the front end to install best management practices, and then ultimately to certify farms as kind of environmentally friendly. That has a kind of broad indication of best management practices and nutrient loading practices. So ultimately, the Michigan Department of Agriculture would be the first kind of point in that enforcement regime, and the second would be the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, actually in the rivers and in the water bodies themselves.
Thanks, Pete and Nick. The next question I have is a little more focused on what the individual can do. And the question I have is that's been submitted is, what are some things I can do in my everyday life to minimize damage and to help the Great Lakes? And Megan, I don't know if that's one that you could maybe take a crack at. I know that your group does a lot of thinking about very local water quality projects.
Oh, on an individual level, there are a lot of different things you can do to conserve water. Just even in your own household, there's actually a link that you can look into. It's called a footprint calculator, and you can Google it online, and it asks you a different range of questions, and it'll let you know how much water you're using and how much your footprint affects basically the world. And with that information, it kind of makes you a little more aware of what's really going on.
Great. Thanks so much, Megan. That's very helpful. The next question is asking specific to the executive order that Ohio Governor Kasich signed yesterday. As Pete mentioned and as news media reports have noted, the executive order focuses on 8 specific watersheds in Ohio. And the question is asking, do we know what criteria was used to identify the 8 watersheds and for targeting in this executive order? So Molly, I don't know if you want to start off with that one.
Yeah, sure. So my understanding is that Ohio EPA, through some water quality monitoring data that it's been using, was able to identify those specific watersheds within the Maumee River Basin as exceeding by 2 or 3 times the phosphorus loading targets that were identified under Annex 4. So these are watersheds that are contributing, you know, not just too much phosphorus, but too much phosphorus by 2 or 3 times. And so really hot spots that that require some concentrated effort potentially in order to drive phosphorus levels down. But Pete, I don't know if you have more to add to that.
Yeah, the Ohio Department of Agriculture is formally going to make these recommendations on the 19th, as I mentioned earlier, and so they should be compiling a formal report, kind of laying all that out. But that is exactly right from what we know at the moment. These are 2 to 3 times higher than the targets set under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, and so that was why they targeted these specific areas in the Maumee Basin.
Thanks, Pete. The next question I have is actually not about Lake Erie, but I think a good reminder for us that we see these kinds of harmful algal blooms most severely in western Lake Erie, but there are other parts of the Great Lakes that do suffer from a similar problem. And the question I have is, the question that's been submitted is there any information regarding Lake Michigan's algal blooms? You know, the commenter says it appears to be better this year, but we continue to see blooms appear. And I know that in Lake Michigan, there are sometimes algal blooms in Green Bay, and up in the state of Michigan, there's also on Lake Huron, there are blooms in Saginaw Bay, I think, Lake Huron. So Nick, I don't know if you want to chime in on that, or Molly, about some of the other places that harmful algal blooms appear in the Great Lakes, and sort of what the status is there.
Yeah, so harmful algal blooms are definitely an issue across the Great Lakes region. They're actually an issue across the country. And so it's definitely not just a Lake Erie problem. You see them in inland waterways in all of the states. You see them particularly in bays in a number of the Great Lakes. Jen mentioned Green Bay in Lake Michigan. Definitely a harmful algal bloom there almost every year, I think every year. A lot of that being driven by manure from agricultural fields, but also, you know, some of the same things that are driving algal blooms in other places: polluted runoff from cities, failing septic systems, harmful algal blooms in Saginaw Bay. And so this really is a regional problem. Obviously, Western Lake Erie gets a lot of attention, in particular because there was such a significant traumatic event with so many residents losing drinking water several years ago, and so there's a lot of attention to this. But agricultural pollution driving harmful algal blooms across this region is a problem in every state.
Yeah, this is Nick. I would agree with that. And as a general rule of thumb, it starts from the south and kind of moves north and stays along the coasts and shallower and warmer, water bodies, obviously. In addition, we haven't yet mentioned kind of municipal stormwater runoff, which indeed cities like Grand Rapids have worked hard on the separation of their stormwater and sewer systems and have completed that task entirely. The city of Grand Rapids has, and those contributions are a piece of this equation as well. And I think it might be fair to say the west side of Michigan has maybe focused on that as much as they have on farms and rural septic fields.
Thanks, Nick. The next question that's been submitted is asking, we've certainly focused a lot in this webinar on state and provincial level policies. And the question submitted is asking if there are any developments in regards to federal policy or law. And so I will start off with Molly, and then Tony may have some perspectives from the Canadian side of the border.
Yeah, so on the U.S. side of the border, one of the most significant programs that exists to address particularly agricultural runoff is the Farm Bill. And both the House and the Senate have passed farm bills this year that include substantial amounts of funding for conservation practices that get used in watersheds like the Western Lake Erie Basin to help farmers apply practices that reduce polluted runoff from getting into Lake Erie. And those are dollars actually that get made available across the country to farmers for conservation practices. It's the largest conservation program in the country, really. And so those dollars are really important, and those programs are really important. They, however, are voluntary programs and usually offered on a first-come, first-served basis. And so, one of the things that we continue to press upon in terms of the additional actions that are needed is that those voluntary incentive-based programs are absolutely necessary, but they aren't sufficient. We need more saturation of conservation practices across agricultural lands in order to actually tackle the problems in Lake Erie and in other watersheds across the Great Lakes Basin. And so that's what we're pushing for in rescuing Lake Erie and, some of the moves that we're hoping to start to see in some of the jurisdictions.
Thanks, Molly.
Yeah,
Tony, do you want to? Oh.
Go
ahead, Tony.
Yep. From the Canadian side of things, I mean, it's important to recognize in Canada that our provinces are the primary level of government responsible for water management. Now, the federal government clearly has a role here because of the binational nature, and they are signatory to the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement between the two countries. So. Primarily programs at the federal level, or policies at the federal level in Canada relate primarily to providing funding initially for a lot of the science that went into developing the domestic action plans. And I believe now there are a set of funding streams for monitoring programs and a specific funding stream under the federal government's Great Lakes Protection Program related to preventing toxic and nuisance algae. And of course, the key area for that is the Lake Erie Basin. So I don't have a lot more detail on that, but it is primarily funding driven in terms of the federal role here in Canada.
And I should have mentioned from the U.S. perspective that even though the House and the Senate have both passed versions of the Farm Bill is not done. They would need to conference that, and it's uncertain whether a Farm Bill will actually get done this year or whether it'll end up getting punted to the next Congress. And another program that I just want to briefly mention, because Nick, you mentioned stormwater runoff and runoff from cities, is that the state revolving loan funds are another really important program that Congress provides funding for that helps cities across the Great Lakes region address failing water infrastructure. And so that's another program that we advocate for, and that's really important in terms of addressing pollutant sources, but also making sure that more people have access to clean and safe drinking water.
Thanks, Molly. I have a couple of questions that I'll sort of combine into one, asking for resources for educational purposes for, teaching either college or high school and younger students. And I would just put in a plug for the Ohio Sea Grant, particularly Stone Lab. They have a lot of great resources available for the public, and they just unveiled some new ones earlier today, explaining, which are some great explainers about harmful algal blooms, the challenges that the lake is facing, and you can also submit questions for experts. But I'll open it up to our panelists if they have any other suggestions for resources for educators who are teaching this issue to their students.
Jen, it's Tony. I think it's from Heidelberg University, but the website lakeeriealgae.com provides a really, I find, kind of good top line view. And it's a great website to get a sense of the issue and wrap your head around it.
Yes, I should have thought of that one first. Thank you, Tony. The next question that I have gets at sort of the different contributors of the nutrient pollution that lead to harmful algal blooms. And the specific question is asking, how much does residential fertilizer contribute to the problem? So Molly, would you be able to sort of help us understand how these different pieces fit together?
Yeah, so residential fertilizer is not a big driver of harmful algal blooms in western Lake Erie. And in fact, a number of companies, including Scott's Miracle-Gro, a number of years ago, voluntarily removed phosphorus from most of their lawn fertilizer. And now a number of jurisdictions don't allow the use of lawn fertilizer with phosphorus in it unless you have a soil test that shows that you need it or you're starting a new lawn. And so lawn fertilizer, something you should look at and make sure, you're not buying lawn fertilizer that has phosphorus in it. Most lawns don't require it unless you have a soil test done that shows that you're missing it. But in terms of contributing to harmful algal blooms in western Lake Erie, it really just isn't a significant source. But other folks from some of the specific jurisdictions, you guys may have a perspective on this. Nope, sounds like I covered it.
Thanks. The next question, and we're sort of getting close to wrap up, so I'll make this a little bit of a round robin question. We have somebody who's just asking sort of what's the next big event or big report coming out? And so maybe I'll go around to each of our panelists from the various jurisdictions and sort of what do you think is sort of the next big thing that we should be looking at as far as action or opportunities to get engaged on this issue in your jurisdiction. So Pete, I'm going to put you on the spot and maybe start with you.
Yeah, just building off of what I said earlier in the executive order, I think that now became the front and center for action going forward for us, which is looking at the Ohio Soil and Water Conservation Commission. If the proposal from yesterday does make it to them on the 19th, just see how they act on it, make sure that they do enact it and vote yes on it. And then after that's done, the panel of legislators that will need to make the agency rules, JCAR, again, which is the Joint Committee on Agency Rule Review, to see how that process goes, what the details of this executive order actually end up looking like. And so those are probably the two most pressing things now with yesterday's action.
I agree. This is Crystal in Ohio. I agree with those actions. And then later in the year, we're also going to need to pay close attention to the lame duck session. With this being an election year and us getting a host of new legislators next year, we anticipate that there may be some movement on environmental legislation towards the end of the year, but there's no way of knowing for certain. And so we will be paying close attention to all of the legislation going through the House and Senate at that time as well.
Thanks, Crystal. Nick, do you have a perspective from Michigan?
Yeah, so our legislature is in summer recess, and when they come back, we'll have a much better indication of whether or not a uniform septic code has legs and what we might make progress on this year. Do we at least make some progress on funding and the collection of data, where those systems are statewide and kind of what percentage are failing, and set up a good reporting regime. And then second, the biggest piece I think is around the civic discourse. Will water continue to play a major role in the campaign and in kind of the issues at the gubernatorial and local level? As we see, it is right now, but you never know what will happen, so we'll watch that closely.
Thanks, Nick. Tony, a perspective from north of the border there?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a whole lot more to say than what I reported in earlier, and because we're on the other side of electoral change. So I think the main thing to be watching for in Ontario is really and directing concern and perspective to our new government that this is an important issue, and and as Molly said, it requires sustained action. So kind of a bit of a waiting period as the new government kind of takes hold here in Ontario to determine what key steps are going to be taken. But the main message really is we need to all stay the course on this stuff because Lake Erie is so critical to environment and economy and local communities along the shoreline.
Thanks, Tony. And Megan, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on sort of what the next big thing is for you all in Toledo and looking forward over the next few weeks and months.
I'm just going to piggyback off what Crystal said. I think we really need to spend more time focused on the candidates that are running this year and what their goals are and their values, and make sure they're in line with what we want to see accomplished.
Thanks. I have one final question, and Pete or Nick, you may have some specific thoughts on this. And the question is asking about some of the actions taken recently by the Trump administration, reducing the amount of federal protection under the Clean Water Act for smaller tributaries and wetlands. And the question is whether or not that will worsen the algal problem, the harmful algal bloom problem in the Great Lakes. So Pete or Nick, perhaps, do you have any thoughts on that?
This is Pete in Ohio. I think if those safeguards and some of those standards are weakened, it could certainly make things worse for just water quality in general. And so, we're hopeful, and the Farm Bill was mentioned a little bit, and the House version has some provisions in it that would significantly remove or weaken and then remove the clean water rules. So we are very hopeful that all the things that they keep trying to attach that to do not make it through and are left intact. Some of that's really the best defense we have for some of the smaller tributaries.
Thanks, Pete. Well, we are just about at the top of the hour. So thank you all to our panelists for providing this very helpful conversation today. And thank you to all of the attendees for joining us and asking a lot of great questions. As I mentioned earlier, we will send out a recording of the webinar along with links to each of the organizations today, as well as some of the resources that were referenced on today's call. So thank you all very much for participating, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.